You already suffered in silence. While the world thought everything was okay, Charles Dickens too, but his pain was not shout. He became literature, and almost no one noticed. In this video, you will find out the secret wound that shaped each story, every character and every word of Dickens, a silent pain that changed everything. If this message touches your heart, write, "My pain also writes my story," and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving videos that play the deepest in you. Before recognition, before glory, before the books that changed literature, there was a boy, a slight boy, with a close eye and soul marked too early. At 12, Charles Dickens was not attending school. I didn't play on the street, nor dreamed of the future. It was in a factory. A dark, dirty, smelling factory with grease and walls that kept more secrets than windows. While other children smiled, he hid his own tears in silence, because there, no one wanted to know if he cried. The reason was simple and cruel. His father had been arrested for debt. The family broke. The little they had of Apu, and Dickens, as a boy, was pushed into the adult world as being released at sea without knowing how to swim. No one asked him if he was ready. No one appeared to protect him. And the most hurt is that for a long time no one knew. He never spoke of it openly as he lived. Your readers did not know. Your fellow writers do not. Not even his children heard from him the real weight of those days. But who reads his works carefully realizes there is something there that burns. A pain that does not go out. An echo of a past that was never completely digested. Working in a factory at 12 was more than a difficult step. It was a break in the soul, a trauma that shaped everything he would write. It was not just physical tiredness, it was humiliation. It was the feeling of being disposable, not to import, to be alone in the world with a responsibility that no child should carry. And perhaps it was precisely this pain, hidden and not verbalized, which has become the strength of his writing. Because if Dickens never told this suffering with all the lyrics, he shouted him in each character, in each rejected orphan, in each wronged child, in each crushed worker. That pain became raw material. It became fuel. It became a mission. But even transformed, she never disappeared. The memory of the factory, smell, cold, loneliness, accompanied him to the end of life. There were times when he stopped writing, and it was as if he was back in that illuminated basement. Because some pains don't pass, only hide, and Dickens hid them behind their genius, as who tries to protect the world from their own history. This is the suffering he never told anyone, at least not in direct words, but it has infiltrated sneakily on every page you wrote, in each subtle complaint, in each silent cry, because there are wounds that do not bleed out, bleed inside. And Charles Dickens, even surrounded by applause, carried his childhood interrupted as a silent weight. And that is perhaps why he knew how to give so much voice to the forgotten, because he himself knew, in the flesh, what it was to be one of them. Charles Dickens never said aloud how much it hurt. He was the admired writer, the chronicler of society, the man who made the whole England laugh, cry, and think. But behind the fame, there was something no one saw. And that may not even be able to name clearly. There was a secret, one that did not fit in direct confessions but spread through the lines of every romance he wrote. The fiction was the shield he chose, not to hide, but to protect yourself. Because what he needed to say was too big, too deep, too dark, and at the same time too true. Therefore he gave new names to his own pain. He recovered his wounds with other faces, and so was born its gallery of characters. Orphans, rejected, wronged, children abandoned to their own luck. But none of them were just creation. They were fragments of him, small parts of what never healed. Oliver Twist was not just a hungry boy. He was Dickens at 12, asking for more than food, asking for affection, for dignity, for a chance. David Copperfield was not just a protagonist. It was the closest attempt to tell his story without saying it was his own. And Nancy, Joe, Little Nell, each carried a piece of his soul. Writing for him was more than I work. It was survival. It was a way of organizing the inner chaos to shape what it did not stop hurting. It was as if, when putting his ghosts on paper, he found some relief. As if, when giving voice to the pains of others, he finally listened to his. Literature for Dickens was the only with where he could exist whole, wounded, human, and yet worthy. Many saw their works as entertainment, others as a social criticism, but few realized that behind each dialogue of each metaphor, there was a heart trying not to get lost. Writing was your way of breathing, to continue, of not crazy about the memory of a childhood that has never said goodbye. And even if no one knew, he left clues, small signs, a phrase that looked casual but hid despair, a character gesture that revealed abandonment, a recurring scene, that of a child forgotten by all, except by him. Because that was Dickens's secret. While everyone thought he wrote about others, he wrote about himself. But the most impressive is that in doing so, he was not closed in his own suffering. He universalized him, turned his mirror pain. And so those who read Dickens carefully find out more than stories, discover themselves, your own weaknesses, their own forgotten memories. Dickens didn't want to pity, I wanted truth. And so he hid his suffering in the midst of the stories, so that when he finds him, we would not see him like a lament, but as a gesture of courage. Charles Dickens was not a man who talked about himself, at least not directly. He rarely mentioned his difficult childhood, the factory where he worked, his father's arrest, or the lived humiliations. To those who lived with him, it seemed an intense, brilliant writer, a chronicler of society. But there was a territory within him that few reached, a territory made of silence, a past that he carried like who carries a broken glass in his pocket, carefully not to bleed, but always feeling the weight. The pain he lived had no name. It was not spoken, it was not shared, but she had echo, and this echo spread through his works with such a deep force that even without knowing its origin, the reader felt his presence. It was something between the lines, in the way the characters suffered silent, in the way abandonment was described with almost intimate details. It was as if, when writing about others, he was trying to say what he never got about himself. This silent pain has not disappeared over time. It was not overcome. She just changed her clothes. He dressed in Orphan at Oliver Twist, rejection in David Copperfield, of humiliation in Great Expectations. Dickens didn't seek to hide his wound, but I didn't want to open it either. Then he disguised her. He gave her plots, characters, metaphors. He transformed his pain into art but did not dissolve it. She remained there, alive, in each word. And most impressive is that even without named it, he made this pain something collective. What started as a personal scar became a mirror to thousands. The suffering he never explained in public became universal language. And perhaps that is precisely why their stories still touch us so deeply, because they are made of truths not said, but felt. Dickens didn't need to confess. He didn't need to write an autobiography so that we knew that his literature was memory. Each plot was a reunion with what he couldn't forget, and maybe he didn't even want to forget. Perhaps writing was the way he found to keep his own part that the world tried to erase. It was an unnamed pain, but there was a voice. It had a face. It had echo, and this echo crossed the time. Because a pain doesn't have to be glaring to be deep. She just needs to be true. And Dickens, with all his genius, made his own truth a legacy. In the end, what was left was not a man who surpassed everything. It was a man who decided not to hide anymore, which transformed the unspeakable into language. And that so to this day he speaks to those who feel, even without knowing how to explain what they feel. Chapter 4. The man who laughed in public but cried in silence. In the eyes of the world, Charles Dickens was a success, a literary giant, critical acclaimed, loved by the public, read on several continents. His presence at the parties was always noted. Your name, reason of reverence. He was seen as a strong, charismatic, full of vitality. But behind the stage lights, there was a silence that no one heard, an emptiness that even the greatest applause could fill. Dickens laughed in public, yes, but cried inside, where no one reached. Behind that attentive look and sharp feather, there was a man deeply marked by his own story, and not just for poor childhood, but for something even harder to name it, the pain of emotional abandonment and the guilt of surviving. Because while he was rescued from the grease factory, others remained. Children who never left, that were never seen, saved, remembered, and this silent guilt accompanied him to the end of his life, as if he carried inside his chest a debt that no book could pay off. He smiled at Multidoys, but his soul was still a boy left behind, a boy who had convinced herself that to remain loved, she needed to prove her own value, all the time. And so Dickens never stopped. never rested. Wrote compulsively. It was presented with energy that bordered the exhaustion. Worked to the limit. But that was not just ambition. It was escape. A desperate way to stifle the inner noise of the memories that insisted on returning. Behind the scenes, Dickens crashed a war that few knew. The war against the feeling that it was not enough. Against the memory of an absent father, a cruel system, a stolen childhood. He was a man divided between gratitude for winning and the pain of knowing how many did not overcome. And it is in this paradox that your writing becomes even more powerful, because as much as he had conquered the world, he never forgot the boy the world ignored. He didn't talk about it. There was no room for vulnerability in a scenario of fame. But his letters, his intimate reports, his prolonged silences in the most unlikely moments, everything denounced. Dickens was injured, wounded in a way that does not bleed on the outside, but erodes inside. And perhaps that's why your literature is so universal, because even without saying, he said, even without crying in public, he allowed his pages to cry for him. There, in his stories, he allowed himself to feel, and when feeling, it offered the reader a safe space to feel either, to also recognize the pain we cannot always explain. The man the world saw smiling was the same who, at night, faced old ghosts, ghosts that used known voices. That reminded him of the factory, of abandonment, of injustice, of fear, and how much it still lived in it. Dickens the celebrated was also Dickens the silent, and it was from this tension between light and shadow that his immortal work was born. On the outside, Charles Dickens was the admired author, the man of firm speech, the consecrated name. But inside there were cracks that he couldn't even hide completely, and these deep cracks ended up overflowing in their intimate life. Because no one crosses the injured childhood and is unharmed from love. The pain not resolved, especially the one that has never been named, finds a way to infiltrate relationships, and that's what happened to him. Dickens had deep problems in his relationships. His marriage to Catherine Hogarth, who began with promises and hopes, has deteriorated over the years. Emotional distance, constant disagreements, silences that hurt more than discussions. He, the man who knew how to describe feelings perfectly in books, often failed to live them with truth at home. And that didn't happen for coldness, but for excess, poor pain. Because those who suffer silent for so long develop invisible defenses, barriers that do not seem dangerous but who go away day after day those who try to approach. Dickens was a divided man, between what he felt and what he allowed to show, between what I wrote and what lived. And in this space between the two, many of their relationships were lost. He walked away from his wife. He kept a controversial call with a young actress. At the same time, the weight of guilt and the desperate attempt to find something to fill him. But how to find fullness when the void comes from so far? When you grow up believing that love is something that can disappear overnight, it becomes difficult to trust even in the love you have. Dickens loved it, yes, but it feared even more. His sentimental conflicts were not wide-open public scandals. They were internal struggles that overflowed in misunderstandings, distances, silences, and decisions. And maybe he couldn't even explain everything he felt, because there was, inside it, a past that never stopped pulsating. A constant echo of abandonment, of lack, of fear of not being sufficient. And this is what makes it even more human. He was not untouchable genius. He was an injured man trying to find balance between the light he offered to the world and the shadow he kept for himself. And like many, he stumbled upon trying to reconcile the two. But even in the midst of his effective failures, Dickens never stopped writing about love. And perhaps precisely because he has experienced the most silent pain of intimacy, he managed to describe the human heart so accurately. He understood what it is to want to approach and not know how. He understood what it is to hurt who loves himself without intention. He understood because he lived. His sentimental life was, yes, a reflection of unresolved pain, but it was also a reminder that even the brightest carry deep dilemmas, and that often who most comforts others with words still struggle to find peace within themselves. Chapter 6. The spectra in A Christmas Tale were his own. A Tale Natal is one of Charles Dickens's best-known stories. He deals around the world, adapted numerous times, revered as a fable about redemption and generosity, But what many don't realize is that behind the old Ebenezer Scrooge, there is something much more intimate. Scrooge was not just a character. Past of the present and the future were actually the ghosts that haunted Dickens himself. At first glance, it may seem exaggeration, but when you read the work carefully and you know the author's trajectory, everything changes. Those spectra were not created only to move, were built from real pain, memories that insisted on returning when the lights went out. The abandoned boy, the frustrated teenager, the divided man. Dickens was haunted by everything he lived and never told. And A Christmas Tale was perhaps its most honest way to admit it. Like Scrooge, he was persecuted for what he left behind, for the injured childhood, for the faces that could not help, by the choices he made in silence. But unlike Scrooge, he did not wait for a spirit to begin his transformation. He wrote Dawn, as who tried to exorcise his own ghosts by placing them on paper, as if he said, "If I numb the pain, maybe she weigh less. If I give voice to these spectra, maybe they stop screaming inside." And that's why A Christmas Tale is not just a Christmas story. It is an intimate ritual, an attempt to release. The metaphor is clear. There is only redemption when we look back without running away. When we face what we avoid, when we let the pain speak and then we hear it. Dickens understood that, but instead of living this process only with you, it shared with the world. And it was this gesture that made his work universal. Scrooge was cold, closed, hardened, and many saw him as a symbol of bourgeois selfishness. But for Dickens, he also represented a part of himself, the part he wanted to protect himself from feeling too much. That feared surrendering to affection and being injured again, who tried to control the outside world because he could not control the interior. And the ghosts, they were real, not those of sheets and currents, but those who visit us when everyone sleeps. When the past knocks on the door and the future seems too far away, Dickens knew them and faced them with the only weapon he had, the writing. I wrote as those who scream in silence, as those who beg for peace, even while constructing stories. A Christmas Tale was its disguised confession, your attempt at literary redemption, and so it is still so alive, because each reader, at some point, is also Scrooge. It also has ghosts. You also need to stop, look back, and choose another way. And as Dickens taught us, sometimes for that, all we need is the courage to write, or at least the courage to listen. Behind the image of the consecrated writer, the respected man in the courts, the name quoted in halls and universities, there was something that never changed in Charles Dickens, the boy from the factory, that 12-year-old, forgotten around the world, with his hands covered with grease and his eyes full of questions that no one answered. That boy did not disappear over time, just learned to disguise, lived inside the adult, watching, feeling, writing, because despite everything, he never grew completely. It was as if somewhere deep, time had frozen. Success came, yes. The books sold, the audiences applauded, but inside it still existed the echo of the voices that called him the useless, a burden, the problem. There was still the smell of the factory, the sound of loneliness, the memory of the feeling of being forgotten, not by an enemy, but by the world itself. And this wound, though silent, never healed. Dickens did not pretend it did not exist, nor did it show it clearly. He transformed her. He took that hole that was in the soul and made him a source of stories, characters, complaints. He knew that that boy, invisible in childhood, was now heard for thousands. And so he decided that he would not use his voice to exalt his victory. He would use to give voice to other boys who were still trapped in the factories of the world. Gasting Pape's building can look a biographic detour, but for Dickens it was a milestone, an early baptism in the world of inequality. There he learned that childhood can be stolen in silence, that not every adult starts big, some start injured, and that often the deepest pains are the ones that no one sees. Because the factory boy was not just him, it was a symbol. It was the portrait of a neglected childhood, and he would never allow this portrait to be forgotten. And even after fame, travel, recognition, he still carried that. Carried in the eyes P.P. Authors between the lines. And he also carried the impulse of resting without rest, as who tries to compensate for lost time, as who still fights, secretly, to prove that he is worthy of being loved, noted, remembered. But Dickens did something extraordinary. He didn't use this pain to close, he used to create. It did not allow itself to be just a victim of life, transformed his own wound into art, and with that, the suffering resignified. It has shown that even what has broken us can become raw material to raise others, that the humiliations that have marked us can become bridges if we have the courage to touch them again. The factory boy never disappeared, but he learned to write, and he wrote so much with so much soul that his pain became voice, not only for himself but for millions. Charles Dickens was not just a genius of literature, he was a survivor who knew how to use pain as a tool, and not any pain, but a deep, continuous, unreted pain. A pain that was not healed but channeled, that was not forgotten but cut in words. His genius was not born of peace, born from inner chaos, of the emotional node that never broke down. And that is why their stories cross us, because they are not beautiful, they are true. Dickens understood suffering as few, not for having read about him, but for living it daily, even at the height of fame. The childhood marked by abandonment, the weight of early responsibility, the silent guilt of being saved as others sank, the sentimental ghosts that pursued him in silence. All of this formed the invisible fabric of his soul. And instead of denying it, he wrote. He wrote, even turning wounds into characters, trauma into plots, memories into metaphors. Every book of yours, however well structured and brilliantly written, carries a subtext of pain. There is no romanticization. There is no pity. There is a silent urgency, a help disguised as literature. It's as if he said, every page, I'm feeling it, and maybe you're too. Let's go through together. The connection with the reader was not coming from language. It came from the truth behind it. The beauty of Dickens's words is not in the forms but in the weight they carry, in the feeling they support, in the abyss that do not hide. He wrote with technique, yes, but above all, with living flesh. With eyes that had already cried more than they could tell, and with a heart that, though exhausted, still found the strength to feel the pain of the other. This rare ability to feel deeply and transforming it into art, that's what made him immortal. Because the pain he narrates does not age. It is not limited to the Victorian time. It reaches us because it is ours too, because there are still invisible boys, forgotten women, exploited workers, broken hearts. And when we see ourselves reflected in his stories, we realized he did not write only about himself, wrote about us. Dickens's untreated pain became a literary ingenuity, but not a cold, mechanical ingenuity. A mill made of soul, of cracks, of memory. He created whole worlds not to escape reality, but to reveal it with more courage. And so every time someone reads Dickens with an open heart, a part of it is rescued. A part of the boy who suffered, the man who fought to stay whole, and the writer who turned scar into ponte. What thrills us in Dickens is not style, it's sincerity. It's not the vocabulary, it's what pulsates behind the words, because in the end, the greatest literature is not the one that impresses, but the one that recognizes with humility the pain of existing and chooses to turn it into something that heals. Charles Dickens has never published a complete autobiography. He never sat before the world and said with all the letters what it really hurt. He never gave the reader a book to say, this is my story, this is my wound. And yet each work of yours is an unlavos outburst, a contained scream, a request for understanding disguised of fiction. Dickens did not write his pain as confession, he wrote as art, but for those who feel deeply, for those who know the silence that burns, their lines are impossible to ignore. He never made the luxury of completely undressing in public, perhaps because the society of the time would not allow it, maybe because he couldn't do it himself, but even without writing directly, he insinuated. And these insinuations hurt more than explicit words. They were in the silences between dialogues, in the eyes of a character who accepts misery as destination, in the melancholy tone of those who seem to have hope, but have learned not to wait too much. Dickens shouted where no one heard, and whispered where everyone pretended to hear. He created stories that looked about others, but came from within. And only those who have suffered deeply can realize that behind each plot there is a lament that he never vocalized clearly, but echoes hard in the heart of those who recognize the pain when it appears disguised. David Copperfield is the closest example of a confession, but even there, Dickens contained himself. He said enough for the sensitive to understand, and hid the rest under fiction, because sometimes telling everything hurts more than enduring alone, and he carried this duality in himself, the desire to be understood and the fear of being too vulnerable. His silence was eloquent, and in a way intentional. He knew the attentive reader would notice that, at some point in the narrative, would anyone wonder, is he talking about himself? And it would be. It has always been. Dickens never used his own name to vent, but used each word to open gaps in his fortress. And in these gaps, he let out pieces of the soul. What he lived was too big to fit in a single book. That is why it spread its story in fragments. He divided his pain between characters. He dissolved memories in metaphors. His outburst was not written at once. He was whispered throughout a lifetime. And only those who read with their hearts will listen clearly. This is Dickens's secret. He didn't need to confess, because the true pain, when it is too deep, reveals itself in silence, and his literature is made of this, of all that he did not say, but was still heard for generations. Charles Dickens was, for many years, the most famous author in England. Acclaimed by critics, read by crowds, invited to noble dinners and public events, his name was synonymous with talent. His presence aroused respect. But still, inside it, the pain continued. Silent, persistent, untouched, because fame does not heal trauma, and recognition does not erase the memory. The factory boy was still alive. He just wore better clothes and walked in more expensive carriages. Dickens proved that success can open gates, but it doesn't close wounds. He was applauded standing, but he slept with memories that no one saw. Memories of the marked childhood, the loaded humiliation, the shame that was never completely named. Literary rise changed its reality, but it did not change the emotional foundation on which it had been built. And perhaps that is precisely why his work has never lost his brightness, because it carries the tension between light and shadow, between public glory and internal silence. He did not write from security, wrote from the crack. Even at the height, even when the world revered him, he knew that ancient pain was still there, not as an enemy, but as origin, as a memory of what forged his vision, as a memory of what never wanted to see others again. Dickens was aware that fame could be dangerous. She deceives, drunk, distance, but he never allowed himself to forget where he came from. He carried the memory of the cold floor, the scarce food, the invisibility, and so even when he had everything, he never failed to write about who had nothing. His real success was not to have won the publishing market. It was to have survived yourself. Have crossed the trauma without becoming bitter, having reached the top without stepping on those who stayed behind, having used your voice not to self-promote, but to protect those who had no voice yet. Dickens reminds us that the real success is to keep the soul intact. It is not corrupted by vanity. It is not letting the applause stuff compassion. He proved that although the pain of the past continues to echo, it can be transformed into foundation, in purpose, on mission. And that's what he did. He chose not to erase the injured boy that existed inside him, chose to listen to him, and as he listened to him, he wrote stories that the whole world began to listen to. Success can take you away from origin, but only the courage to face this origin can make sense of conquest. Dickens won the world, yes, but what made him eternal was what he never hid, that even at the top still existed inside him a boy seeking shelter. Chapter 11. Silence as a shield and as a weapon. Charles Dickens never told everything. He never sat down to reveal, clearly in detail, the ghosts that have haunted him since childhood. He could. It had fame. There was space. There was a voice. But chose the silence. Not by cowardice, but by strategy. The silence was your shield. This is where he hid the most vulnerable, most bleeding, most dangerous of himself. And at the same time, it was his most powerful weapon. For in every word he silent, there was a hidden scream, a cry that turned into literature, a protest disguised as fiction. Dickens knew that if he put everything in a book, his pain would be reduced. It would be labeled, seen as a victim. And he didn't want mercy. I wanted impact. I wanted to wake up collective consciousness. And so, he silenced. But it didn't be silent. He preferred to speak subtlety, let the characters cry for him, that the orphans shouted what and he never said. May the injustices that destroyed with words serve as a response to the system that almost crushed him. He used silence as who builds wall, not to hide from the world, but to preserve what the world would not understand. And at the same time, he used the same silence as a sword, to attack, to denounce, to elegantly hurt those who pretended not to see. His books are made of this, of what he has decided not to say directly, but is present in every detail, in every entrance, in every pain narrated with surgical accuracy. Dickens did not explode. He didn't shout it on the streets, did not write political manifestos, but his revenge was even deeper. He exposed with elegance and persistence the same mechanisms that wounded it, and in doing so, he disarmed the social structure that condemned him as a child. He showed the world with irony and compassion how the system fails, as the little ones are discarded, how dignity can be destroyed in silence, the same silence he has chosen to dominate, because silence can also be a force field. And Dickens learned to use his with mastery. He didn't shout it about the factory, but made millions see the horror it represents. It didn't cry in public, but it made your characters solve for generations. His silence was never absence. It was tactical. It was resistance. It was language. He understood that the noise does not always convince, that there are pains that can only be counted through the non, that there are revolutions that are born on pages, not in squares, and that there are protests that are eternalized because they do not impose themselves, just remain. Dickens's silence is uncomfortable, it's dense, it is full of meanings, and precisely for this reason, it is so powerful. He did not need to say everything to make everything feel. His strength was not at the exhibition, it was in the suggestion. And to this day, those who read it with sensitivity realize what he chose not to tell, he says more than any confession. Like Charles Dickens, you may also carry a pain that no one knows, a chapter not told of your life, a memory that insists on hurting even over time. Perhaps, like him, you have learned to smile on the outside while fighting inside, keeping everything working while carries a still weighing past. But today, in the face of this journey, we reveal there is a truth that cannot be ignored. Your pain need not be your sentence. It can be your language, your strength, your signature. Dickens did not stop feeling, it did not stop suffering, but he did something that changes everything. It turned suffering into word, and the word on bridge, in light, in shelter. He wrote because he needed to breathe, because I needed to organize the inner chaos, and in doing so he allowed others to find his own way. Now you can do the same too. Your pain, no matter how silent, has something to say. She doesn't have to be buried, nor hidden, not even denied. It can be recognized, heard, and finally converted into something larger, because the wounds that become words become power, become testimony, they become liberation, for you and for those who listen to you. You may never publish a book, maybe never write a phrase on a paper, but its story is being written every day with courage, with falls, with silent overcoming that no one sees, but God sees. And that is enough. Just understand that your pain also writes your story, not as defeat, but as a force that brought you here. So today, declare with faith and courage, my pain also writes my story. I will not be defined only for what hurt me, but for what I chose to do with it. I will no longer hide the parts that hurt, because they make me real, human, true, and perhaps necessary for others. If Dickens had silenced, the world would have lost more than stories. He would have lost the echo of a soul that refused to pretend it was okay. And you also carry this choice: silenced or transform, forget or illuminate, run away or write with your own life, a new chapter where pain doesn't define you, but it reveals you, because you are not alone. Because every tear that falls in silence can turn into something that heals, and because there is a powerful beauty in those who decide to continue even injured, and yet find meaning on the way. Yes, your pain also writes, and if you allow it, it can write something that will never be forgotten. Charles Dickens did not tell everything he lived, but left clues. His pain shaped his greatness, and your pain can also shape yours. You don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the most silent pain is the one that has the most power of transformation. Subscribe to the channel, enjoy this video, and activate the bell, because here every hidden pain finds a meaning, and every forgotten story gets a voice.